Welcome to the TTS Talking Educators podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in educational settings. Hello, my name is Dr. Shaddai Tembo, your host for this week's TTS Talking Educators podcast. I'm a senior lecturer at Bath Spa University, an associate lecturer at the Open University, and an independent writer, speaker and consultant for critical early years. Now, throughout this series, we'll be discussing a range of topics aimed at supporting oracy in primary and early year settings, inspiring you with guidance and resources to enhance your practice. This week, I'm delighted to introduce Louisa Reeves as our guest. Welcome to the podcast, Louisa. How are you today?
Thanks, I'm good.
It's brilliant to have you here. And before we get into it, perhaps you could just give a short introduction to yourself for our listeners.
Yes, so my name's Louisa Reeves. I'm Director of Policy and Evidence at Speech and Language UK. And I'm actually a speech and language therapist by professional background. So I've worked for the charity for a number of years in lots of different roles, but primarily kind of driven by a passion for communication and speech and language and how powerful a tool that is for social justice, really, to enable people to really kind of fulfil their potential. And I've worked across the board, really, from early years through to FE, with young people who needed a little bit of support and confidence around their oracy skills, through to young people who communicate in lots of different ways and have really quite profound and significant speech and language challenges.
It's brilliant, Louisa. I think before we go into the nuts and bolts of what oracy and speech and language is, I'm really interested in your background as a former speech and language therapist. How did you get into that, and how did you end up where you are today working for Speech and Language UK?
So I've always really been passionate about communication, and I had a friend when I was growing up who had Down syndrome, as it was called then, Downs, and really struggled to make himself understood and got very frustrated. And I think that sort of kind of set me on a bit of a path to sort of think about, I really like communication. It was a choice between kind of an English degree and speech sciences when I was looking at university options, went down the speech and language therapy route, spent some time in the NHS, which was a great part of my life to be part of that incredible institution, but also grew a little bit frustrated by long waiting lists, the challenge of kind of being quite restricted in the practice, and I could really see the impact that speech and language challenges had on children in school, and in terms of their educational attainment, but also in terms of their sort of friendship and their well-being and their overall development. And the work that Speech and Language UK does is that it kind of takes that speech and language therapy expertise and it cites it in the education context, and also very much in the context of parents, and kind of putting the tools in the hands of parents and educationalists. And that's kind of been my sort of lifelong passion, if you like, really, is to take that kind of that incredible science and knowledge, but share it out so that it is something that everybody can do, because communication is everybody's business. It doesn't sit in a small kind of one professional sector.
Communication's everybody's business. I love that phrase. I'm really interested in how you would define oracy for someone who's perhaps unfamiliar with that word. And to be really clear, why do we need to focus on it so much? I know you've touched on social justice, but perhaps you could expand on that a little bit more about the value of it for all of us.
Absolutely. And I think oracy is one of those difficult words that can be defined in different ways. And certainly at Speech and Language UK, we're really clear that oracy for us is it's about articulating ideas, developing understanding, engaging with other people, and that's through speech, through language, and through communication. So that really kind of however you communicate, whether you use sign language, whether you speak languages other than English, whether you use a a communication aid, you're enabled to kind of fulfill that part of yourself. And I think, it's a unique human skill, communication, isn't it? Everybody, that's one of the things that connects us, wherever we are, is our ability to communicate. And that spoken form of communication is the first one that we start to use as babies, as infants, making those sounds, having parents and other adults sort of repeating those sounds back to us, that to and fro interaction. I'm doing it with gesture as well, is just really fundamental. And what we find sometimes at Speech and Language UK is that families and families in some communities of this country don't have those messages about how really vital very early communication is. So that idea of speaking to your baby, of being able to give your baby and your toddler experiences that then generate that excitement, that give them something to talk about, that help them to develop their knowledge of words and the way they can use language, it's a real social divider in this country. And I think we've seen that exacerbated through the lockdowns associated with COVID, through the cost of living crisis. We've seen this real kind of divide between families who've been able to provide lots of communication opportunities for their children, who have a lot of talk within the family, who go to schools that enable and support talk, and we have other families who have less of those advantages. And really communication skills are kind of the key for a speech and language therapist, but I think more broadly we're starting to think about that in our schools as being that opportunity for young people to get the jobs they want, to have the careers they want, to have the relationships that they want, to be able to manage their own well-being and mental health, to be able to kind of find their way through social media, through this idea of fake news, through being able to disagree agreeably. Communication is part of everybody's life. There aren't any jobs that you can do now that don't involve communication. So it's an absolutely core skill for us to give our young people.
I think that's really important what you were saying about how communication and language runs through everything in all of our lives in so many different ways. But what you're talking about there in terms of the intersections with class and poverty, that for me feels really important in terms of how we can support educators to work with those parents to make sure that all children have those opportunities to engage in speech and language in a really meaningful way. I know that Speech and Language UK do offer lots of practical resources, but I also know that you do research as well. And I'm really interested in some of the survey findings that you've put out recently and what you've revealed around the importance of speech and language.
Yeah, so I'll say a little bit more about Speech and Language as a charity, if that's okay, because I think sometimes, lots of people have never heard of us. Lots of people have never heard of the issue of speech and language challenges, but sometimes people come across kind of one thing we do, like our policy work or some of our talk boost interventions, but we work in kind of four main areas really. And the first one is around providing tools and training for practitioners. So whether you work in early years, you work in primary or secondary school, if you work in mainstream or in special school, we've got a range of kind of training and resources, and I can say a little bit more about those later on, but they're all evaluated and evidenced. So we're really clear at Speech and Language UK that we want to use the evidence, as I say, from speech and language sciences, but also from education. But we also are very keen to measure the impact of what we produce, so that we don't want people to spend time doing something that isn't actually going to really impact on outcomes for children. So that's a big area of our work. The other area of our work is support for families and parents and young people themselves. So we provide a lot of digital material on our website. We have a helpline for parents. Again, I can say a little bit more about that, hopefully, if there's an opportunity. The third area of our work is that we run 2 special schools. So we have 2 schools in England, one in the south in Surrey and one up in Nottinghamshire, for children and young people with really severe speech and language challenges. And a lot of our knowledge and practice is kind of grounded in that everyday experience of challenge that those young people have and the opportunities that we can give them through our work. And then the fourth area that you've mentioned is our policy work and our public affairs work. And we're really passionate campaigners in terms of justice, if you like, for young people with speech and language challenges across the piece. So we've looked at the intersection between speech and language challenges and mental health. And then, as you say, we've looked also at that intersection between speech and language challenges and behaviour and how behaviour is managed in schools. And I think that's probably the survey that you asked about.
Please do share a little bit more.
Yes, I will. So we do a survey of teachers every year. We've done that for the last 4 or 5 years. And we ask them a number of questions. We ask them, what percentage of children in their class they feel struggle with talking and understanding words, because that's really at the heart of speech and language challenges. And every year from that answer of 1,000 teachers, we kind of extrapolate out from the whole population of children in school. And when we started doing it, it was about 1.5 million children. Last year we did it again, and it's now up to 2 million children. So there are 2 million children in England's schools where teachers are concerned that they're struggling. So in the same questionnaire, we also asked them, teachers, whether they felt that children and young people they work with were ever unfairly punished because of their speech and language challenges. And 78% of teachers said yes, which is a really, that's an amazing statistic. I think that's acknowledging, that's teachers acknowledging that the system is not working for children and young people with speech and language challenges. And I think we can see that in the behaviour policies that we're seeing promoted in some sections of the education sector, in how those behaviour policies are interpreted by schools, and the consequence of not understanding those rules, not being able to explain why you've done something, not being able to kind of keep up with the pace of lessons. We know that's a challenge for children with a broad range of speech and language challenges, but also for lots of other children as well. So, that there are some schools that insist on eye contact with the teachers. We know that young people who are neurodiverse, or in fact young people from Afro-Caribbean communities who are taught not to look adults in the eye because that's disrespectful, they'll kind of fall foul of those systems. And so part of our campaign around this unfair punishment, so support not sanctions is our campaign, is around helping teachers to realise that actually underlying a behaviour may be a speech and language challenge, and that actually a flexible approach to behaviour policies will result in a happier teaching experience for everybody, more young people staying in school, better attainment, better attendance, and just a more inclusive school setting for all young people.
I'm sure listeners will be very surprised on hearing that statistic around teachers reporting that. I'm interested, based on your experience, whether that number has been the same for a number of years, whether it's going up or down. What's your sense of how that number's changed, and are we right to be so surprised at that statistic?
Well, I think overall we've seen the school system become less supportive and inclusive over a number of years, and I think there have been a number of drivers behind that, but one of them is around behaviour policies. And I think we've always known, there's quite a body of research on the link between mental health and well-being and social emotional behavioural difficulties and speech and language challenges. There's a really classic piece of research by a researcher called Hollow et al. That was done in 2014, and they found that actually about 80% of children with emotional and behavioural disorders also had speech and language challenges, and quite often those were unrecognised. So they'd either sort of been referred for speech therapy when they were little and not attended, or they'd never been seen by a speech and language therapist. So I think that kind of gulf between teachers quite often knowing there's a problem, this child's presenting with challenging behaviour or not attending or not learning, but they often don't understand that underlying that is a speech and language challenge. And I think that if we can kind of close that circle and get teachers and parents and families to think about language first, particularly around behaviour, then I think we can probably achieve quite a lot, because if we can manage those speech and language challenges, a lot of that behaviour then falls away.
Wow, I'm hearing so many challenges and issues around speech and language that you've identified in this first episode, and we'll certainly go into more practical strategies for both parents and educators in the next few episodes. But for now, I think that's a really good place to end this first episode on the importance of establishing communication for life. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guest Louisa for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Educators podcast with me, Dr. Shaddai Tembo, and Louisa Reeves. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your setting and links to relevant resources.